Hello, Patreonicans. I really can't think of a good name for all of you. Yes, this is the Patreon exclusive bonus MXtra video for Season 6, Episode 30. Thank you, as always, for being a Patreon member and hanging with me. And just pause for a second while I talk to somebody else. Hey, everybody out there. If you are listening to this and wondering how you're getting Patreon content, that was by design. This is an example of the kind of bonus material that I provide at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, and I've decided to release it for free, partly because I needed a week of material, but also because I wanted to show you the kind of stuff I do, these short bonus MXtra videos, among other things, exclusive music and all of that, that you get on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre for, again, as little, for now, for as little as $1 a month. Please consider going over there. Now let's go back to you, Patreon people. Thanks for hanging with me for that PSA. This is exciting. I'm usually excited about everything I do, but in bonus episodes, it kind of goes back and forth. In this case, it's one of my favorite bonus MXtra videos. If you remember, episode 30 was Elvis. Death is Dumb, volume 17. And as promised, this is on the true origins of rock and roll, which I'm sure a lot of you out there know parts of this. I knew parts of this, but you will be blown away by the things that I discovered, which are, again, easy to find. I put them all together for you here. And let's get started. I've mentioned this before in passing about how rock and roll and so many other genres, what we think of as the starting point, is always several years down the line from when it actually began. So the first thing to say about rock and roll's origins is that they're not in the 1950s. Now, I think you may have known that if you had any sense of where rock and roll came from, but that is a very clear fact. Rock and roll didn't start in the 1950s. Of course, the second thing to say is that African Americans played the largest part in developing what would become rock and roll. Not fully, in many ways, very much the largest part. And the third thing to say is that this origin story, and very important, is a love affair between white and black cultures. Something that music has often done best, that art has often done best, and done over and over for a good 150 years. Yes, there's been appropriation, there's been stealing, there's been not giving credit. That's been a part of this relationship for just as long, and certainly farther back in history prior, but the modern music era is rife with it. It still is, maybe not as much as before, but let's be honest. Yet, from the standpoint of most musicians, and I said this in the main episode, it is a love affair. Musicians are by nature musically inclusive, in that they're taking from whatever they've listened to. And we have all worked with people from all walks of life, musically speaking. And that's to the benefit of music and people and the world. And so even if you say this person did a song in a certain way that was clearly appropriation, the idea of doing the song is not a bad thing. It's how you do it. It's how you frame it. It's the credit you give. It's the credit you give to your influences and things like that. The general consensus is that rock and roll became a distinct form of music when rhythm and blues merged with country. Now, I could just end this here because that's basically true, but it ignores so much. Several other contributing genres, all of which predate the 50s, some by a lot of years. So let's start as far back as we can go. The 1940s, 1930, it was a 1910, Boogie Woogie, generally a faster-paced subset of blues with a light swing beat, has its origins in Southern African American communities since at least, wait for it, the 1870s. So one of the earliest origins, and not the earliest, but one of the earliest origins of the world that we know of as rock and roll was the 1870s, 80 years before the 50s. Boogie Woogie didn't become popular in the wider culture, meaning not to white people, till the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Think Boogie Woogie, Boogie Bug of Company B, and so many songs like that. It's one of the first styles of music that I learned on the piano. There was a book of Boogie Woogie left-hand bass that I learned. The impetus for Boogie Woogie is said to have been the railroad. So from the beginning, as I mentioned in the main episode, motion has played a huge part in rock and roll. You can hear the railroad clickety-clack in Faster Boogie Woogie. And the first name of Boogie Woogie actually was most likely, to the best of historians' knowledge, Fast Western, which was named after an old railroad line from the mid-19th century. African Americans gave the term boogie woogie likely from a bunch of African words, all meaning either dance, run, dance wildly, and or beat a drum. So a lot of motion, movement, rhythm, and all of that. Side note, boogie woogie and its cousin ragtime had big influences on swing music. That's basically where swing music comes from, especially 20s and 30s, which will come into play in my origin narrative shortly. Blues, of course, has played a huge part in rock and roll. Not just from the beginning, but over and over and over. It's been a touchstone. Primarily, the musical form and how the standard 1-4-5 chords morphed. So let's say C, F, G in a certain order, which can change somewhat. Although there is a kind of a standard known blues, like a lot of ones, then a little bit of fours, then some ones again, and then a quick up to the 5, back to the 4, back to the 1. But that has morphed in many ways. It's also added in the 2 chord, the minor 2, the minor 6 chord, variations of that, on and on and on. B played a huge part in rock and roll, the rawness of the vocal delivery and the rawness of the lyrics, often dealing with situations, life situations, personal issues, sex, and other forms of recreation, dancing, and all of that stuff. Excuse me while I pick up my mouse. Brought to you by patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. And C, the repetitiveness of the lyrics influenced rock and roll in the sense that they're enough to be catchy, have hooks, but not monotonous. Such a huge part. If you combine the ideas of swing and blues, you get something I mentioned in the main episode called jump blues, which formed in the 1940s and was a huge precursor to rock and roll. Any jump blues song I ever heard is so close to early rock and roll, and often even more energetic than early rock and roll, certainly late 50s, early 60s rock and roll, that it may as well be rock and roll, usually without a guitar. Side note, gospel, not really more of a side note, particularly shouting gospel, which I did mention in the main episode, was always so side by side with blues that it bled into the formation of rhythm and blues, R&B, and eventually rock and roll. Especially the soaring and rousing and often raw vocal delivery and the deliberate rhythmic pacing, often fast, but even slower forms that have that groove influenced rock and roll. Jump blues is basically up-tempo jazz that adds elements of blues and boogie woogie. Though Louis Prima wasn't an originator or strictly jump blues, if you know Louis Prima's style of music, you can kind of hear what jump blues is. Louis Jordan, early Lionel Hampton, and Roy Brown are some people. Roy Brown, Good Rockin' Tonight was that 47 song. It's a slower version of rock and roll in all but name. Oh, wrong. Also the name, considering the name of the song is Good Rockin'. 47. 3 other major developments in the 1940s that helped to form rock and roll. Number 1, rhythm and blues, was jazz with a heavier beat. Or blues with a more driving rhythm, and a renaming of one style of many that were called race music to make it more appealing to white people, of course. Genre naming makes companies money. Remember that. You may put that on a t-shirt. Country music, number 2 in the 40s, the southern white counterpart of blues that started forming in the 1920s as a more driving version of long-standing folk music traditions, developed an offshoot called alternately hillbilly boogie, okie boogie, or country boogie. Just so starting to merge white and black influences already. You had the boogie woogie and, the boogie. And then number 3 in the 40s, once again, moving forward the separating of quote-unquote race music from its association with African-American culture. Record companies, particularly the owner Leo Mintz and eventually Alan Freed, the DJ, started renaming R&B to rock and roll to make it more appealing to everyone. Doesn't say great things about society, but it worked, and it changed history. Note, this is where it gets fun, if it's not fun already, on the origin of the term rock and roll. So we've been as far back as the 1870s. That's pretty damn far back. The term rock and roll has been around since at least the 1800s, since at least the 1600s, used by sailors to describe the boat's motion. So again, motion, such a big part of it. It was slowly put into more general use over the decades and centuries to describe anything or person with that motion, the rocking and rolling motion. And by the 1800s, often referred to, it referred a lot to the motion of trains. When you were on a train, you were rolling, but you were rocking back and forth. So rock and roll. By the 1800s, late especially, it often referred to as well ecstatic religious movements in African American churches. So rocking and rolling as you're feeling the rapture, possibly. And this is, again, if you think, oh, rock and roll, it's sailor, it doesn't count, whatever, boogie woogie, not rock and roll. Get it. I get it. That's an influence. But the first song to use the term rock and roll, and I'm not going to do my joke because I've done it enough. It's not the 1940s or 30s or 20s. It's from 1881. The song was called, are you ready for it? Rock and Roll. And recordings of songs subsequent to that used that phrase rock and roll as early as the mid to late 1890s, practically the dawn of recorded sound. By the early 20th century, the feeling of spiritual rapture that rock and roll described and was most closely associated with at that time was applied to other feelings of rapture, most notably partying, and most notably sex. And when a lot of people, the origins of rock and roll, they will mention sex, that's what it meant, and it did. For a good period, it did. It wasn't the earliest meaning by far, but it did mean that for quite a while. So by the 1920s, a decade second only to the 1940s as being seminal in the development of rock and roll, there were songs being recorded that used rock and roll in terms of partying and sex. Dozens of songs or more used the term in their titles or lyrics throughout the first 5 decades of the 20th century. But the first time it was used to describe the feel of music was, again, not the 50s, was the late 1930s. In various music reviews, critics, certain jazz songs that had a kind of swing and drive would say that they rock and roll. So by the time record companies started applying to it to officially to music in the late 1940s, it was already familiar among certain music communities because it had been written about in that way. And again, we'll get to Alan Freed in a second. Some huge progenitors of rock and roll, Big Mama Thornton and her precursors, who did big and raw blues that often had not even thinly veiled lyrics about sex. You can find recordings from the 20s and 30s of blues song that use all kinds of profane language. Just like in the movies at the time, the censors didn't get their hands on it until the mid-1930s, the Hays Code of 1934, made, of course, by a hyper-religious dude, a Presbyterian, which held on until, I think, the late 60s. So kind of sick, but that's the way this culture is, afraid of its own shadow. The aforementioned Roy Brown's Good Rockin' Tonight from 1947, considered by some to be the first true rock and roll song. Some say that is the first true rock and roll song. It's, again, pretty early. 1949's Rock and Roll Blues by Earlene Rock and Roll Harris. So note, again, women play a huge part in rock and roll's creation, as they did in hip-hop and other kinds of music. Most often, though, the first song to be considered true rock and roll was 1951's Rocket 88 by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. Ike Turner and his band, The Kings of Rhythm, sung by Brenston, basically. So Ike Turner. Basically a brasher version of jump blues. And before I did this research, I would cite Rocket 88 as the first rock and roll song. I don't think that's true anymore. So Alan Freed, why do I mention him? A DJ in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, and beyond, very consciously trying to integrate music, both from the creation side and the fan side. He is credited with disseminating the term rock and roll as a way to promote music by black artists to white fans. And he did this, again, as early as 1951. Patreon gets to hear me drink. Some often also say that Johnny Ray's 1951 Cry was a first because of its raw and overt sexual energy. And that's more on kind of the rock and roll ballad side, so the R&B, style, thing that we know, Earth Angel, whatever, the Great Pretender. What most people consider the dawn of true rock and roll is when guitar entered the picture, which brings us right back to the 1920s, because blues and country were being codified to be acoustic and then eventually, very soon after, electric guitar music. So that circle of merging the rhythms of boogie woogie, jump blues, etc., which jump blues didn't usually use guitar, with music that did use guitar, finally happened in the mid-1950s with recording artists like Bill Haley in 53, Bo Diddley, who recorded later but was performing even earlier, and Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and yes, Elvis in 1954. But since we know that tons of rock has been made, I argue before and definitely since, without guitars, it really comes down to approach, attitude, sound, style more than anything else, which is why I contend that Good Rockin' Tonight, for example, is a rock and roll song. Quick end note. Rock is different from rock and roll. How? Scale. Rock, harder, louder, usually longer, broader in style and what elements it contains. But it's, of course, the next phase of what rock and roll was. Some conclusions. So the quick list of styles, if you want to skip all of it and just say this to people, the quick list of styles that contributed to the creation of rock and roll, in a sort of chronological order: boogie woogie, country boogie, blues, gospel, country, folk, up-tempo, jazz and swing, jump blues, rhythm and blues. Pretty great list. All those put together created rock and roll. Certain sound and production tweaks, along with promotion, naming, zeitgeist, meaning how people perceive and consume the music, have to happen before music, people accept music as something different from its origins. So that's why people say rock and roll 1954, whatever it is, because all that came together to form the impression that this is a new music. But it is clear that the origins of rock and roll far predate what we commonly think. And again, I say that for every single kind of music. By the time it gets to us, the consumers, it's been around for a while in one way or another, even if it hadn't been named yet. And I double down on that. And I double down that most music created from a blend of other kinds of music is 100% a love affair at heart. And one of the best messages for anything in this world, no matter who or how much others corrupt it, which can happen. It starts and ends as a love affair, and that includes what Elvis did, all of rock, disco, hip-hop, and on and on. Thanks, Patreonicans. Please come up with a better name for you. Just whatever it is, I'll use it, even if it's, I don't even care. And thank you, people out there, for hanging for this glimpse of what you get on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. I'll talk to you all soon.